So I want to give you quickly a bit of context about what, when I was asked to do this, what I've been thinking about in terms of the 5 good ideas and what it means to be fundraising in the era of the digital age. You heard from my bio that I used to be part of Canada Helps, and there was really privileged to be part of a process called My Charity Connects. And My Charity Connects was about teaching charities how to understand, make sense of the revolution that's out there, the revolution of social media, the revolution of expressing your brand through things like Twitter. So how do you express an entire mission statement in 140 characters or less, as an example? And this is the culmination of lessons learned. So if you came here today to learn how to use your Tumblr account better, you're going to be disappointed. Because I'm not going to go through, log in, set a password, reset password, change email address yet again. Now this is how you post. I'm going to talk at a very top level about how the evolution of what's happening in the digital space has, in some ways, changed the nature of fundraising. But in fact, if the alternative title for this is that everything old is new again. So I'm going to walk you through some things that actually may sound like common sense. And you may sit there going, well, of course. He's not saying anything new. But I actually want to use this analogy that perhaps you've seen this ad on TV. It's for, I'm a Honda fan. I drive a Honda Accord because I'm a dad. So I have a very exciting Honda Accord with 2 kid seats in the back. So Honda ads are really exciting to me. But there was one a couple years ago, which I think actually got to the crux of what it's like to be a Honda dad. And it showed a fellow at the Honda dealership sitting in a Formula One race car built by Honda, which is they have a huge racing pedigree as a company. And he's sitting in it, and he's kind of making vroom vroom noises, and he looks up at the dealer, and he's like, so how much? And the guy goes, $5 million. And he goes, but does it come in blue? And the guy's like, no. He's like, okay, I'll take that. And he points to the Odyssey minivan that he can actually afford, and that is the real practical car for him. So why is that like fundraising in today's era? Here's the challenge. The digital era has, among other things, quickened the pace. It's also made us more connected as organizations to the people we're serving. Really, really good. Quickening the pace may be not a good thing, but connected to the people we need to serve, connected to our donors, those are important things. But it's like drinking from a fire hose. It's like driving a Formula One car at 300 kilometers an hour down the straightaway. It's hard to do unless you've got the fundamentals right. So it's okay, and I learned this when I was a university student and had a $2,000 car, it's okay if you know that the front tire is a little wobbly and the gas tank tends to read empty even when it's half full, as long as you don't go too far, too fast, and you'll make it to the cottage to have a good time with your friends. But when you're going 300 kilometers an hour, which is what the new age of fundraising and digital experience now seems to require of us, you need to have a pit crew. You need to have tires that work. You need a machine that's finely tuned. And the hardest thing about being in the nonprofit world is the one thing that we don't do is do the maintenance to our own organizations, to our own philosophies of fundraising, to make sure that all the pieces are in top order and that we've actually sat back and thought about making sure that's ready to go before we accelerate to 300 kilometers an hour in fundraising. So the digital world is forcing us to do that, and I want you to think about that as we go down the road. So I'm going to show you a slide that is about, it's an ad, and it's not an old ad. It was an ad that used to drive me absolutely crazy because it, to me, is the example of, and I don't know if people over there can see it, but I'll read it to you in a second. It's an ad that was up on the side of a building during what is actually the ongoing crisis in the Horn of Africa around famine and drought. And it was an ad that I had to look at every morning when I'd pull into the parking lot to go to work. And it made me crazy. And that was a good thing because it made me want to work harder to do the things that are right. But it also made me crazy because it was the perfect example of everything we tend to do wrong in the nonprofit world. So the ad is a huge picture, huge banner on the side of a building, and what the headline on it is, while you were on summer vacation, more than 29,000 children under the age of 5 died of starvation in Somalia. Please remember to give now to active supporting relief organizations. I probably don't need to go around the room and ask you what you think is wrong with it. And I bet several of you have some ideas about what's wrong with it. And if any of you in this room are responsible for it, you may want to disavow any knowledge of this ad. But it, to me, was a perfect example of the old way of fundraising. The idea, one, that guilt was the way we would fundraise, that the you hear it all the time, the ad on TV with the flies, et cetera, the kid. That's not the way to fundraise. But it's also about the overwhelming need we seem to feel and that we need to suppress to use big numbers, like 29,000 children. And it also needs to get away from the idea that we are afraid to ask for something specific. So I'll tell you right now that I don't want to feel guilty when I'm a donor about the fact that I took summer vacation. I deserved summer vacation after working, especially in a nonprofit where you're working more than 8 hours a day, guaranteed. I can't conceptualize 29,000 children, and I definitely can't conceptualize 29,000 children who are under the age of 5. It is a mind-blowing statistic, and when it's that big, it means actually nothing to me. It's supposed to mean something. The writers of this, I'm sure, thought it would mean something important, but it doesn't. Unfortunately, it's too big and too hard to comprehend. And please remember to give now to active supporting relief organizations is probably one of the worst asks I have heard in my life. And I had a campaign chair that would do that kind of an ask. We'd go through the pitch, and at the end of it, he'd go, and so I was kind of hoping you... And then I would, as the staff member, I'd have to step in and goes, what he's asking for is, would you be prepared to make a commitment of $100,000 over 5 years to help fund an MRI at the hospital, or something of that nature. This is so not specific, it's so vague, and it's not what you're going to remember when you get home that night after a busy day to think about giving. So this is where we're going to start, and I'm going to take you on a journey of the 5 things that I think will help us overcome, especially in an era of where the digital world's making us accessible, be better fundraisers overall. So number 1, this is going to sound intuitive, and a lot of these points are counterintuitive. And they're counterintuitive because if you've gone to any fundraising event, fundraising session, the person up here has told you to become a better storyteller. And I'm an English major. That was my undergrad. And I will tell you, we all in the sector actually do need to become better storytellers. And you should go to those sessions at AFP and at fundraising conferences that are run by organizations around the country to tell your story better. And I just came from a session with my staff at the MS Society telling them to tell the story better. But I'm actually going to tell you today, the secret is you need to take it a step further. We need to up our game. We actually need to stop telling our story and start listening. And I'll explain what I mean by that. This is the reality today of getting information in our email box, voicemails, the boss wants a report, the board wants a report, the budget is due, Twitter is overloaded with some issue that's happening, and the last person we want to talk to is the donor who calls, because there are just one more thing we have to deal with. And that's a huge problem when the idea of fundraising is to be talking to our donors and asking them for money. But that's the reality. That's the reality of what's coming in the pipeline in our plates. And I'm going to tell you what we're missing as a result of not listening to our donors. I think most of us would think we are listening to our donors. But I'm going to give you an example of how in the non-social media, non-digital age, it's hard to listen to donors. And then I'm going to give you the example of how it's changed and turned on its head. So this is a story. I recognize a few faces, by the way, in the audience who've been to sessions of mine before. And if so, you may have heard these stories before. So I'll try and add new details. The way my wife's heard all my stories about 10 or 12 times, so I try and change up the details every once in a while, just for her benefit. So I used to work at a hospital foundation. I used to work at Sunnybrook Hospital. And we were in the middle of a campaign when I was there. It was a very intense period. We were trying to raise $300 million for hospital needs and hospital priorities. We had, like every nonprofit in the world, long hours, dedicated staff, and it meant that when you left at the end of the day, you were often crossing through a fairly empty parking lot. You were going to the staff parking lot, which, like any hospital, the staff parking is a problem at any hospital. Staff are at the lowest level of that parking problem, so you have to walk 6 or 7 kilometers from the front door back to get to your car. And you go by and get the doctor's parking first, then the visitor parking, and then you get to the staff lot. So I was crossing the visitor parking lot. And as I was crossing the visitor parking lot, there was one car very clearly parked with 2 people standing outside of it. Looked like a mom and a daughter. And they were embracing each other. And they were directly in the path from me to where I needed to go. So I was looking at that as they're hugging. Maybe I should give them a bit of space, a bit of, I'll walk around and then continue on towards my car. So as I got closer and was giving them a wide berth, I realized that the mom and the daughter were crying. Tears are not an unusual thing at a hospital, But of course, it's a challenging scenario because they're in a very evident spot. They're in the parking lot. They're not in a patient care room or a family room. They're out in the parking lot hugging and crying. And of course, I start to think, I think as anyone would, curiosity starts to think, why are they crying? Is it they've just lost a loved one, just been given tragic news, a diagnosis? What's the story between this mom and this daughter? Or is it even a happy story? Because that's a possibility. Is it possible that the mom's just been told, you know, those 3 years of chemotherapy and radiation treatment you've been given, you're finally clear. And they're hugging because never again do they have to pull into this parking lot and pay $22 an hour, but also that they don't have, the experience is over. They're free again. It could be any of those moments that we don't know what it is, but there's lots of reasons why people would cry at a hospital. So my mind was churning through those possibilities. And then it churned through the next possibility that actually scared me more than anything, and that was that as the Vice President of Development for the Hospital Foundation, we send out lots of direct mail. And one of the things we do is if you're a patient of the hospital, a couple months later, you get in your mailbox a letter that says, this is the wonderful story of our hospital. This is the research we do, the work, the equipment we have, and so on. And we hope you love the story of our hospital so much and you had such good care that you'll consider giving. I'm sure that these people would get that letter. To this day, I have no idea what their story is. I don't know what their connection is, what department they were in, what the story of why they were crying in our parking lot, and how they responded to that letter. But I spent hours with my team, days with my team, working on building the best possible story of the hospital. And there's a problem there where I was never able to, and I'm sure the staff have never to this day been able to connect with that particular story of the parking lot. And I contrast that with what happened when I joined my next job at Canada Helps. And Canada Helps is about online giving, and if you're interested to hear more, they don't pay me to do this anymore, but I'm happy to promote them because they're a great organization. One of the tools that Canada Helps has is a gift card, a charity gift card. You buy the card, you make the donation, and you give it to a friend, a family member, a teacher, a colleague, and they get to use it to spend it on the charity of their choice, which is a great concept. But what's really interesting is I bought a bunch of these and gave them to friends as a test when I started at Canada Helps to see how people would use it. What charities would they support? And it's an interesting exercise when you're a fundraiser to think about what charities do your friends support. So we sent them out, and my wife and I, both being in the fundraising profession, that's the other thing that's very exciting about our dinner conversations, was to imagine and guess, basically place bets on which friends would give to which charities. And one friend who we sent the card to, we were absolutely sure we had nailed it. She was going to give to the Heart and Stroke Foundation or the local hospital because she just lost her dad earlier that year to a stroke. So that, we'd sort of locked that one out. Yeah, she's going to give there. We get the email back from her. As an email comes back indicating what charity they chose, if they wish to send that. And it said, no, they gave to the Hemophilia Society. I went, the Hemophilia Society? Interesting, not to do with their dad. It was because the other major family event that had happened that year was the first grandchild had been born in the family, the first child of that generation, and he'd been born and he'd been diagnosed with hemophilia in the weeks after that. So you have a choice, right, as a donor. You invest in the past, like you honor the past, or you invest in the future. Those are two good choices for any donor to be thinking about, fundamentally. Her choice was to invest in the future with that gift. I am quite sure that neither organization to this day, whether it's Heart and Stroke or Hemophilia, knows the story of this particular donor or why she was passionate enough to make that gift card go to their organization. But I know that story, and my wife knows that story, and you can be sure we know how to engage her in fundraising or participating and moving forward in her connection to the organization. I can do that as her peer, but the organization, the professional fundraising staff, to this day will struggle with that challenge. And that's one of the pieces that I'm going to leave with you, to think about the stories that are coming from the donors, that it doesn't matter how powerful the story was from the Canadian Hemophilia Society was. It was the story of the donor that was more important in making that happen. So number 2 is marketing. I almost hate to use the term marketing in the nonprofit world anymore because every time I do it or talk about brand, people use it the wrong way. And this has become, it's not just the nonprofit world, by the way. We're not the only ones. Everyone is complicit in this. It's because mass media has blown this out of proportion. But we talk about marketing as logos, the right color, the slogan, it gets down to, I've heard people arguing about the most ridiculous little things in terms of placement of icons and images on pages around marketing. That's part of marketing, but it's about this much of marketing as I've learned it. And marketing to me is more about understanding truly who your audience is. And we do a pretty bad job, actually, in this sector at doing that. So again, I have a story to tell you about understanding your audience and why we do a bad job of it. And this one, I'm going to talk quickly about Cheese Whiz. I did my MBA up at York, and when I graduated with a bunch of others who were in the for-profit world, they went off to for-profit jobs. And one of them went to work for Kraft, and he was given the account for Cheese Whiz. And his business card was fantastic because it just read cheese marketing, which for some nonprofits, that may be your mission too. I'm not sure. We met a couple months after graduation, and I said we wanted to see how each other's professional lives were going. We met at a bar, and I came in late, and he'd already found a spot at the bar, and he had his laptop open, and he said, "Owen, I want to show you this ad that I've just finished wrapping up, and that we're about to send out to broadcast networks to go on TV." So this is an ad years ago. It went to air, and you may have seen it, but basically it's about Cheese Whiz. And it's about a fellow who late at night, he comes downstairs looking for his midnight snack. He tears through the kitchen. He goes through every cupboard looking he has a jar of Cheese Whiz in the fridge, but it's empty. His teenage kids got to it first. So he goes through the kitchen looking for a full jar of Cheese Whiz, which he cannot find. There's nothing. Cupboards are bare. So he's got a piece of bread, and he's got like a little corner of Cheese Whiz covered on it, but he doesn't have enough Cheese Whiz to cover the rest of it. So what does he do? As he's searching, he looks out the window, and it's garbage night up and down the street. Blue boxes up and down the street. And in each blue box, the camera picks up that there is an empty Cheese Whiz jar, just like the one he just used to cover one corner of the piece of bread, in the blue boxes. So what does a smart guy do at midnight when you need your snack? You go up and down the street, and you collect all the Cheese Whiz jars, and scrape just a little bit out of the bottom of each one, and put it on the piece of bread till it's covered. So of course, the camera cuts next to him stumbling up the porch steps, and the porch light flicks on, and his wife opens the door and gives him the look. I'm sure there's a few husbands here who know the look. There's probably a few wives here who know how to give the look. The look is, "What are you doing?" And I'm embarrassed to be married to you. And she also has the savior piece where she has the new jar of Cheese Whiz that he was unable to find in the kitchen. So he doesn't have to suffer the indignity of spreading little bits of Cheese Whiz on one piece of bread. So my friend closed his laptop, looked at me, and said, "So what do you think? What about this ad?" And I said, "You're going to get fired." And he said, "Why are you going to get, why? What's wrong?" And I said, "Well, it teaches me that the brand attribute of Cheese Whiz that you're trying to sell is that it's still still an edible product after being in the garbage. I'm not sure that sells a lot of Cheese Whiz." And he said, "Yeah, sure, that's hilarious. You're a funny guy. But listen, this is what we did." And he went on to tell me that evening about the focus groups, the market research, and most importantly, he told me, he's like, "You are not our Cheese Whiz consumer. I don't care if you watch this ad or not. Even if you watch it, you're never going to be convinced to eat Cheese Whiz, whether you think it's from the garbage or not, because you're not the typical Cheese Whiz consumer. We know our typical consumer, and we have painted a profile of them. They don't just buy one jar of Cheese Whiz a week, they buy several. In fact, some buy a case a week because they have a family of teenage boys that if they run out of any kind of food, it's crisis." So we've studied them. We know this kind of humor works. We know that this resonates with them. We know it's the female who's the purchaser. We've studied this because we put millions of dollars into the effort of understanding Cheese Whiz consumers. Nonprofits do not tend to put millions of dollars in understanding their consumers, their donors, their patrons, their visitors, their clients. We tend to put this much time in. The time we spend in the shower in the morning going, "Oh my God, I got to get something out. What do I know?" I don't know why great ideas hit us in the shower, but they do. Apparently, there's actually research that shows why the shower is a good place to get ideas. I'm not kidding. It's about the single-minded focus and the routine, et cetera. But good ideas happen here. But it's also where you start panicking about your day and what you need to do that day in terms of board reports and the marketing piece about promoting the next concert, the next donor event, the next client's event, whatever that might be. We presume often our starting point is that we know our donors so well because we also are donors to our organization. But we are actually the opposite of the Cheese Whiz thing. We consume our organization by the caseload, and our donors, our contributors, our patrons consume us in little bits and pieces, and I can guarantee you that most of them never think about us when they're in the shower. So that's a bad focus group starting point. We need to start thinking about our audiences in different ways. We need to start thinking about them like crap. And the interesting thing about the digital world is we're actually starting to get a real glimpse of them through that without having to spend millions of dollars. We can get profiles, we can get their stories, we can learn more about them in ways we never could before. So number 3 is the social media thing is kind of scary. I don't care if you've been in it for a long time or a short time. People are really struggling with this still in terms of how it relates to organizations. Individually, we seem to have it down pat. We can decide to be in Facebook or not. We can decide to put everything up or nothing. We can decide to take pictures of all of our lunch items and post them on Tumblr because it was the most gourmet piece we've ever seen, or not. We can be the person who posts the snide comments. That's fine. But when it comes to an organization's profile, it's really hard to understand what kind of a profile you should you be posting lunch of all your staff on Tumblr as an organization, or should you be making snide comments to others? That doesn't seem like an appropriate role for organizational social media strategy. The thing is, what we really need to do is be let off the leash to do the stuff we used to do really well. Old fundraising campaigns were about peer-to-peer engagement. So when I talked about the fact that I knew my friend who gave to the Hemophilia Society, we used to let our volunteers off the leash to go and do that on their own. They were called campaign, neighborhood canvas or campaign canvassers, and they would go up and down the street knocking on doors and asking people to make contributions to the cancer campaign or the Red Cross canvas. And people, get this, people used to answer their doors when people knocked on the door. And they would actually give money to people, and the craziest part about it is they actually knew the people that were knocking on their door because you actually knew your neighbor in a certain era and a certain time. There are pockets of Canada where that still holds true. But in other areas, it does not. And in fact, it's to the point where the Better Business Bureau of Saskatchewan actually came out and said, don't answer the door when fundraisers come knocking. We think that's a bad practice and should be stopped. So clearly, if you've got the Better Business Bureau on one end saying, don't do it, and you've got people in Toronto who, I lived in a condo for a while. I didn't know my neighbors. And I said hi once to neighbors in the elevator. That's a big mistake, by the way. Don't do that in Toronto, because people really freak out when you say hi to people in Toronto. I'm originally from Newfoundland, so I say hi to all kinds of people, by the way. So it worked. Peer-to-peer worked because you knew those people. The new era of online actually allows you to re-engage with that in ways we couldn't do during the area of mass media, telemarketing, and direct response. My direct response person in the office every day is panicked. She pokes her head through the door and goes, our numbers aren't looking as good as they were last week, and they weren't looking as good as they were the year before, and they weren't looking as good as they were the decade before. And that's because people are less responsive to the mass marketing, the mass media piece, because it doesn't connect. The peer-to-peer does connect, and we need to let people off the leash. And often when I'm doing these presentations, I talk about some of the fundraising where this is working. The only thing I'll say today is that if you want to learn more, you might want to look at some charities, but the area where people are doing this really well is in political campaigns. Go check out Naheed Nenshi as mayor of Calgary and what he did in social media. That is a more powerful social media fundraising campaign than what a lot of charities are trying to do. Check out what Justin Trudeau is trying to do, aside from take his shirt off. And look at what Obama's original campaign was about in terms of some of the pioneering things about social media. There are some wonderful stories out there that are actually more interesting than I think what charities sometimes feel that political campaigns are by nature time limited. They are more risky, so people are taking more risks there than our organizations tend to. So learn from them. That's the one piece that I didn't put in, but I think is an important takeaway. But the other piece that organizations need to not be afraid of is to have some personality. So yeah, you're not going to post your lunch on social media, but I don't want to read another LinkedIn profile of an organization and the constant sort of updates that have no personality at all. Back to marketing, the idea of marketing is to give your organization a personality, an identity. And social media should allow you to let a personality come through. And I'm trying to help an organization right now that is a little bit in shell shock. The MS Society went through a phase where they were reacting to a new research opportunity that was purported to be the cure, and it was very divisive within the organization. It was called it was pioneered by a doctor named Zamboni from Italy. It was sometimes known as the liberation treatment, or CCSVI. Anyway, it really paralyzed the organization, where they stopped talking about anything with any personality, and all their statements were, the MS Society advocates that all patients who blah, blah, blah should seek advice from medical professionals, blah, blah. It's very boring. I can read that on the side of a cereal box, but I don't engage with my cereal box in the morning. I want to engage with the causes that I'm interested in, and I want them to have personality. You've got to figure out how to do that, because every organization needs its own way of establishing a personality, whether that's images, whether that's video. I will tell you right now, it's often not the case to put your ED or your CEO as the personality, because they may not have much personality. But you need to figure out how to craft a personality for your organization online so that it isn't just about stodgy announcements, requests for more money, or an announcement about the fact that the campaign's reached a certain amount, or there's a concert next Tuesday. Those aren't very exciting. There needs to be more to it. There needs to be something. And if you want to follow someone who's interesting and does it well, I was just at a lunch last week with Dr. Samantha Nutt of War Child. Follow her online. Fascinating personality. Now, she's the founder of an organization, so she's allowed to have maybe more personality than some organizations can have, but learn from that and figure out where your sweet spot is in terms of personality and engagement. You don't need to be a hipster to have personality either. And in fact, some people would argue that hipsters don't have much personality and they're compensating. Anyway, never mind. This is one that will also seem counterintuitive. We're in the era of what I call big data. We have more data available to us than ever before. But there's one thing that's very irritating to me, is that's when my staff comes in and says, so we did an email campaign, it got a 10% response rate. Do you think that's good? I said, well, what were you looking for? What were your criteria for understanding if this was right or not? Before you ask me about if the result was a success. And that's part of the problem. We're drinking from the fire hose, or we're driving down at 300 kilometers an hour in our Formula car, and we haven't decided what success looks like. So how many people have small children in the room? Small, or grandchildren. If you recognize this character, it's a litmus test for if you have small children. This is Buddy the dinosaur. He's a baby T-Rex. I have a 3.5-year-old son. He loves a show called Dinosaur Train. Now, first of all, think about that in terms of marketing. Dinosaur Train. You couldn't put two better things together for a 3.5-year-old. That's clearly someone who didn't just have the idea in the shower, but thought about that a lot. By the way, it's a most amazing show in terms of teaching kids about science. My kid absolutely blew away the poor volunteer at the Museum of American History when he explained to him how T-Rex teeth worked. And the volunteer's like, okay, all right. So there's a lot of stuff you can learn, but the other thing my 3.5-year-old did and blew away his grandparents was he has been listening to Buddy. And the one thing that Buddy says all the time in this TV show when he's teaching about science is he comes up to everyone and goes, a hypothesis. A hypothesis is an idea you can test. And my 3.5-year-old walks around and tells his grandparents and everyone else that a hypothesis is an idea you can test. I'm not sure he totally understands what that means, but it sounds really impressive. And our grandparents think that our investment in daycare is amazing as a result. I would submit that we're actually pretty bad at this. The other thing, by the way, I didn't only do an English degree, but I also tried to do a science degree, because why not do everything? Be part of that overeducated, underemployed Canadian set of generation. But one of the things about science is you need to have a hypothesis before you start the experiment. You can't just start the experiment and then take the results and go, well, this is what we found out, so now let's see what happens. That, however, is how most nonprofits seem to be running campaigns or running anything is, well, we think this is good, so we'll try it, but we really don't know what our measures of success are, or halfway through, we change the bar for success. And we need to be thinking more critically about what the hypothesis is before we start. There's so much data coming at us that we need to pick which ones make sense and then understand what they actually mean before you start going out to do the campaign or get the numbers. And I'm going to give you an example. This is a paper, and it's in the list of resources, from a professor in the University of Oregon that wrote about genocide. And he was looking, why do governments allow genocide to happen? Why is this constantly a problem where we send in forces when it's too late to stop genocide? And the researchers, were looking at what's the capacity for human empathy. And he started this path because he had a hypothesis built, again, by a children's daycare. He couldn't understand why we weren't relating to the massive stories, like 29,000 children dying dying in Somalia over our summer vacations. And he realized as he dropped his kid off at daycare that there was a perfect experiment happening right there. And that was they had a big fish tank, and it had about 20 goldfish in it. And the kids didn't really pay much attention to the goldfish because they were more interested in their friends and everything else. The problem was the goldfish weren't doing very well, and they were slowly dying. And in one day, 2 fish would die, and they'd be scooped off by the teachers. And the next day, another couple fish would die. And the kids weren't really paying much attention until there was 1 goldfish left. And then all the kids really got interested in the survival of this 1 goldfish and the fate of it. And was he doing well? Was he better today or worse? Could we help feed him? They gave him a name. They were very interested in this 1 goldfish. And eventually the poor goldfish passed on as well, and the kids had a little memorial service for it apparently, et cetera. But the researcher realized, why didn't they care when there were 20 goldfish, but they cared when there was 1? And he said, can we work that into the larger issues of empathy? So not only did he look at government issues, but they actually did testing through direct mail, for a charity appeal, a live one, where they sent out letters to donors. And in one letter, they talked about the story of 1 boy in Africa and what was going on in his life and why your support would make a difference. And they tested it against a letter that talked about the boy and his sister. And they tested that against another letter that went out that talked about the boy and his family. And they tested that against another letter that went out that talked about the boy, the family, and the village and their needs. So the response rates were higher, and the amount of the gift, average gift, was higher when it was just the story of the boy. And as you added more people, the response rate and the average gift would slope downward and downward and downward each time. And they said, this is really fascinating. So the story of the village is compelling, but we have a problem as individuals connecting and being empathetic with more than 1 person. When you start getting in 29,000, your circuits fry to protect you from the story. You can't envision 29,000 children dying. It's a tragedy of epic proportion, and our circuits would overload if we were able to actually empathize with all of those children and all those families impacted. But if we hear the story of 1 boy, our circuits go into high alert and we connect, and the donations are higher. This is the kind of data we need to be out there looking for and understanding so that we can understand who our donors are and how they react to us. And I will caution you about one thing. We often rely on data as this. So because 3 people have told you stories about how donors are behaving does not make that a focus. In fact, focus groups are bad too. I had a marketing professor that said, if I ever hear you launch a campaign based on 1 focus group, I will come and hunt you down. Focus groups are fascinating. They give you lots of information, but they don't give you the picture of your full marketplace. I'm not going to tell you, we don't have the budgets to do mass market testing, but we need to remember that using the tools we have at our disposal, don't go basing a whole campaign on an anecdote or 2. We need to start being more like, I don't know if you've watched Moneyball, this is baseball season, and or read the book. The book is actually quite fascinating about how the Oakland A's said, we don't have the budget, sounds a lot like a nonprofit, we don't have the budget to hire we don't have a big payroll to hire baseball talent. Instead, we're going to use what's called sabermetrics, which is the crunching of data about players to actually identify who are good players but are undervalued, and we'll hire them. And together, we'll glue them together into a powerful team instead of hiring the big name players like R.A. Dickey, who's doing really well right now for the Jays. But anyway, this is the idea. And it's an idea that I think we need to explore more in this sector to understand, since we have limited budgets, but we need to find our A team, and we need to find the way to do it with greater value with less money. So the last one, and then I'm going to turn the tables on you guys to do some talking. So this sounds counterintuitive because we do know that more fundraising than ever before is coming from major gifts. But I'm going to tell you about a challenge I issued to my staff when I started at the MS Society, and I've issued to others before. The worst thing you can do, I think, to a donor, and this is about being donor-centric, is to walk up to them with your business card and go, hi, my name's Owen Charters, I'm a major gift officer. Here you go. Yeah, the pressure's on. What does it mean to you if you're sitting in your office and a major gift officer walks into and says, hi, love to chat, no pressure? Sure, there's no pressure. You're called a major gift officer. Clearly, your job is about getting huge amounts of money out of my pocket. We know that that's the game. The donor knows that that's the game. We don't need it rubbed in their face with a card that says you're a major gift officer. So you may have a major gift officer in your team. You may be one. Over time, we need to, however, start thinking about the cultural change that we need to make about fundraising, where the donor's at the center. We have professionalized fundraising, which is great. We have become more sophisticated because the world is complex. We work out of towers that look like this because we need to deal with planned giving and tax issues, and we need to deal with complications that come from handling tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of donors, and government regulation, all sorts of pieces. So we go to conferences, we talk to each other, we come to lunches like this, and we go to very few lunches with donors where we actually think about what they need and what they want. Instead, we talk about ourselves as building up the profession. And I've actually been, I'll be really frank, I've gotten tired of going to some AFP events, Association of Fundraising Professionals, for those of you who don't know, because it's been more about talking about a career advancement than it has about thinking about better ways to engage donors. People seem to be there with their business cards, connecting with others because they're looking for their next job. And that's always irritated me. But we have, as in general, started to do a really good job of pulling up the drawbridge in connecting to the donors, and instead saying, in this safe haven of being fundraisers, we can complain about how people aren't giving, or we can complain about the problems of social media, or why we're not reaching out, instead of actually doing the hard work of breaking down the walls and opening up organizations. And the last piece of why that's so important is a younger generation of donors is pretty sick and tired of institutions. They're really tired of organizations coming in, telling them what to do, or messing up their life by saying, hey, we have this huge amount of GDP, debt to GDP that you're going to have to deal with, and we don't have pension plans and retirement plans for you. So they're really tired of listening to institutions tell them how their life ought to be. So they're doing things like starting charities themselves, starting small organizations. And if we look at all like this, even the tiniest bit, they're not interested in talking to us at all. And that's going to be the next generation of donors that walks through the door, and we're walking up to them with major gift officer cards saying, thanks for selling your startup to Yahoo for $1 billion. Would you consider investing in our organization? They're not interested because we represent the old way of doing things to them. We represent an isolated community of fundraisers more interested in our own interests often, or so it appears, than in theirs. And that's something we need to be extraordinarily careful about. So this doesn't sound entirely about digital pieces, but to me this is the Formula One race car. If we can get those 5 pieces and tighten the bolts on the car and make sure that we're using the right high-octane fuel, and that our pit crew, who are the team around you, whether that's volunteers or staff, if you're lucky enough to have staff, that's what's going to take us forward in this age where the challenges are coming at us faster. They're coming where more donors are connected to us than ever before, but their expectations of us, and this is directly a result of the digital world, are so much higher than they've ever been before. It's a challenge, but it's a pretty exciting one. So I believe the process now is that people get to talk amongst yourselves for 15 minutes, and then we open it up for the remainder of the time to, you can grill me, challenge me, you can challenge each other with questions and ideas and how this reflects your reality or how it absolutely does not. I welcome the conversation. So I leave it there. I'm just sort of looking at the crew. I assume that's how it goes. And enjoy the rest of the sandwich or the banana now, et cetera. And we'll call you back to order in about 15 minutes. So thank you.